Now we are discussing the major Pacific battles of World War II. So, this is just a little recap. Again, we know World War II lasts from 1939 to 1945. This will be a test question. Make sure you know this. World War II was a war between the Axis powers of Germany, Italy, and Japan against the Allied powers, which were made up of Great Britain, France, the Soviet Union, and the United States. The Soviet Union, if you remember, had signed a non-aggression pact with Germany, but later they joined the war because Hitler decides to go against his plan and invade the Soviet Union. The United States officially joined on December of 1941 after the attack at Pearl Harbor, which we will discuss. So, Japan's rise. How did Japan become a major player in World War II? So, Japan, again, like we said, is a small island. It lacks natural resources. Japan could not become a powerful country and a world leader without conquering other countries and taking their resources. Battles were fought throughout the Pacific, including Japan, China, Korea, the Philippines, and many more small islands. If you remember, towards the beginning, when we talked about the causes of World War II, we talked about how Japan started to try to take over some of these other colonies of Great Britain and the U.S. and the Allied countries. Japan's aggression. So, they had already invaded Manchuria when World War II started in Europe. In 1941, Hideki Tojo, an army general, becomes prime minister. He wanted to attack the United States. The United States at this point was neutral. He wanted to ensure the U.S. could not stop Japan from invading countries in the future. So he felt like they should now isolate the United States. He decided to attack the U.S. Navy, and he felt that if he sunk enough ships, that he would keep the United States from challenging Japan. At this point in time, Pearl Harbor was kind of a weak spot for the United States. For some reason, they had decided to harbor most of their Navy fleet in Hawaii, which ended up being a bad thing because that became an easy target. Pearl Harbor occurred on December 7th, 1941. Japanese fighter pilots attacked the U.S. fleet. The United States was surprised and not prepared. It happened on a Sunday. It was kind of early in the morning. There were a lot of soldiers that were asleep on the ships or asleep, in their bunkers. The USS Arizona, this is a picture after the USS Arizona was bombed through the attack. 1,000 men were trapped inside. Overall, Pearl Harbor, there were 3,000 American casualties. So immediately after the attack on Pearl Harbor, FDR addresses Congress and asks if we can officially declare war on Japan. Let me go over this first. So in 2 hours, 20 naval vessels were destroyed, including 8 battleships. The USS Arizona was the first battleship to sink. More than 300 airplanes were destroyed. So we have here to the left the USS West Virginia and the USS Tennessee. The Oklahoma capsized, and some of the soldiers drowned. You also have in the background the USS Maryland, but Japan's plan backfired. The United States entered World War II on December 8th. So why was Pearl Harbor not successful? The attack on Pearl Harbor was not successful because the aircraft carriers were viewed as the most important naval vessels. But the U.S. aircraft carriers were not at Pearl Harbor during the attack. They were actually out at sea. Japan also failed to destroy the oil storage facilities, the shipyards, and the submarine docks. So the United States was able to recover quickly. And what did Japan do? This is a quote from one of the generals, the Japanese generals. He says, "I fear all we have done is awaken a sleeping giant." He is talking about the United States as a sleeping giant. Next, we get into the Battle of Midway. On June 3rd, 1942, Japan attacks the Aleutian Islands to create a diversion from their real target. So if you look out here, so this is Hawaii. They attack Midway. So the Battle of Midway Atoll on June 4th. It says the U.S. was not tricked. They knew that the Imperial fleet would attack Midway because they had broken the Japanese naval code. The U.S. fleet had battleships placed in strategic places waiting for the Japanese Imperial fleet. And here we see the USS Yorktown being attacked by Japanese bombers. Again, Battle of Midway. More pictures of the Japanese bombers. This is a Japanese cruiser, USS Atlanta and USS Phelps. The battle lasts 3 days. Japan gave up. The Imperial fleet lost all 4 of their carriers, 250 aircraft, and over 5,000 casualties. The Pacific Fleet lost 147 aircraft and about 300 casualties. The Allies had won. This was the turning point in the war. The U.S. then begins attacking Japan. Now, this is the Battle of Guadalcanal. So on August 7th, 1942 through February 9th, 1943, Japan controls most of the Southeast Asia and was beginning to threaten Australia, which was a U.S. ally. We have here on the map. All right, Japan controlled, the first battle that the U.S. attacked Japanese forces. The U.S. surprised Japan, but Japan did not give up. When the Marines landed on the island, the Imperial fleet sank Allied cruisers off the coast. This is a picture of the U.S. patrol, but this is where the battle is. U.S. Marines were isolated. They were kind of cut off. Japanese troops were sent in. More about the Battle of Guadalcanal. This is the USS Wasp attacked by the Japanese. And then over here, this is another picture of 2 Japanese planes that were shot down. In mid-November, Japan sent in an additional 10,000 troops. The Japanese were unable to advance, and they had to retreat. This marked the first time Japan lost land in World War II. The result, Japan's losses, 31,000 casualties and 38 ships. The Allies only lost 7,100 casualties and 29 ships. Australia no longer worried about a Japanese invasion. We get into the Battle of Saipan. So between June 15th, 1944 and July 9th, 1944, the U.S. began island hopping. So if you look here, this is the Pacific. The Pacific Theater here. So they were trying to take over Japanese-held islands on their way to Japan. So they would take these one by one, and eventually they will take Japan. They wanted control because the island's airfields would be close enough to Japan to use its new B-29 bombers. I'll have to show you a picture of the B-29 bomber. Japan wanted control because they could stop an Allied advance. Let me show you a B-29 bomber. It's not going to let me. Here we go. All right. So this is a B-29 bomber plane. And this is what was used heavily during World War II. A great plane. You can actually see some of these in museums now. So back to this. So when the Japanese commander knew defeat was imminent, he commanded his troops to launch a banzai attack. So on July 6th, 4,000 Japanese troops armed with swords, bayonets, grenades, and knives surprised the Allied troops. This was the largest banzai attack of World War II. 30,000 Japanese troops defended Saipan. When the battle was over, less than 1,000 remained alive. Many committed suicide, as did thousands of civilians. So for the Japanese people, it was considered weak to be taken as a prisoner of war. So they would rather commit suicide than be taken hostage or taken captive by the enemy. Again, we have flamethrowers that are used here. Caves were blasted open. Another picture of a flamethrower. And then we also have rocket launchers. So this was newer technology for the time. The United States continued to carve a path to Japan. We have the Battle of the Philippine Sea. This took place June 19th through June 20th, 1944. It was off the coast of Saipan, and it was one of the biggest aircraft battles of World War II. This is a Japanese airplane that shot down. This is a Japanese aircraft carrier and naval vessel that are under fire. So the Imperial Fleet and the Japanese Air Force were critically damaged. Japan planned on delivering more troops to Saipan, but with the loss in the Philippine Sea, the U.S. controlled the seas around Saipan. 3 carriers were sunk and 400 aircraft were destroyed. One thing that they have not mentioned up to this point in the notes, which you need to know about, are kamikaze fighter planes. Japanese aircraft, their airplanes were actually, most of these people were more or less kamikazes. So if they did feel the need, let's say they run out of ammunition or something like that, then their next plan of attack would be to just fly their plane into whatever the target was. This was a huge win for the Allies. So now we get into the Battle of Lake Gulf. This was October 23rd through 26th, 1944. It was the largest naval battle of World War II. Some consider it the greatest naval battle in history. It's the first battle. Oh, see, here we go. Good, they're going to mention it. This is the first battle the U.S. witnessed kamikaze or suicide attacks. So, like I was saying with kamikaze planes, sometimes what would happen was these Japanese fighters in these airplanes, they would actually start to try to fly their plane directly into the target. So this is a U.S. carrier struck by kamikazes. On the left here, you have U.S. carriers under attack by Japanese airplanes. So at the end of all of this, the Japanese losses were 28 total warships, 10,500 casualties. The Allied only lost 5 and only 2,500 casualties. The Allied forces were able to take control of the Philippines and had greater control of the Pacific. Japan lost major trade routes from Southeast Asia to its home islands. So slowly, the United States was starting to cut off trade routes to Japan, which means they were slowly losing more and more resources. Now we get to the Battle of Iwo Jima. This is February 19th through March 26, 1945. This is memorialized in Washington, D.C. This is kind of a notable picture here. The funny thing about this monument here is that this flag raising on Iwo Jima had actually already occurred a little further on the island. But this picture is the one that everybody remembers. So Iwo Jima is only 5 miles by 2.5 miles. It's very small. And it's around 750 miles south of Japan. So again, remember the United States was slowly making their way to Japan to take over. The Allied troops outnumbered Japanese troops, but the Japanese fought unrelentingly. Before Allied troops hit the ground, planes and battleships were bombing the island. When the Allied troops landed, the Japanese didn't attack them, and they thought that most of the Japanese were dead. This was a trick. So, how did they trick them? This shows outside the naval vessels approaching Iwo Jima for invasion. Again, you see these same kind of boat crafts here. So the Japanese had changed their tactics. They fought from dugouts, caves, and tunnels. And this is going to see something that you'll see again during the Vietnam War. Most of the Vietnamese also have adopted these same tactics, and they fought from tunnels, dugouts, and caves in Vietnam. The Japanese hid until the Allies made their way inland, and then they launched surprise attacks. How did they fight against that? So the Allied troops used flamethrowers to flush out the Japanese from their hiding spots. So if you're not sure what a flamethrower is, it's literally got combustible materials in there. And this is an example of a flamethrower. It shoots fire. So this is a flamethrower being shot off of a tank into an enemy area. Allied troops used heavy artillery to fire on Japanese hiding spots. So as a result of the Battle of Iwo Jima, Allied planes, this says, provided support for ground troops by bombing the Japanese. This is an Allied soldier in a foxhole using a telephone. And these are canines, little pups, used on the front line to find Japanese snipers and carry messages quickly. Both sides suffered huge losses at the Battle of Iwo Jima. It was a very bloody, deadly battle. The Allies suffered 23,000 casualties, and the Japanese had 21,000 casualties out of the 22,000 who fought. The U.S. now had a close base for the B-29 bombers to attack Japan. And again, the Allies win. The Battle of Okinawa. On April 1st through 1945 through June 22nd, 1945, we have the Battle of Okinawa. This is a small island 350 miles southwest of Japan. It was one of the bloodiest battles of World War II. Okinawa could serve as a base for the air raids on Japan, and that is why it was critical. Once again, Japanese troops used caves, tunnels, and dugouts. The canines were used again to find hiding Japanese, and Allied plane fire bombs the area to kill Japanese troops that are hiding. So they would call in these bombs, and they would just drop a bunch of bombs along the mountain ranges. Again, with the Battle of Okinawa, this is the USS Enterprise. It's hit by a kamikaze pilot. We have another picture here. This is a land target. It's hit by USS battleships, or US battleships. Another picture here, Allied troops bomb a cave using dynamite. And again, this is another picture of a kamikaze pilot is serenaded before takeoff. So these are just pictures kind of from the battle. So this resulted in the U.S. plane dropping bombs on Okinawa. As a result, the Japanese casualties, there were 70,000. There were 40,000 Allied casualties and over 100,000 civilians. Civilians are people who are just random people who live there who are not involved in the war. They could either be Japanese citizens or they could be other members. The bloodbath at Okinawa was a major factor in U.S. President Harry Truman's decision to not invade Japan. He decided that these people, they'd figured out that the Japanese were just not going to give up. He decided that it was not worth it to try to risk tens, if not hundreds of thousands of American lives by invading. So instead of just invading, he decided to drop the atomic bomb. So we have the bombs were dropped on Hiroshima August 6th and Nagasaki August 9th. They were cities in Japan. We'll get into more of the atomic bombs when we talk about that in the Manhattan Project. But what you need to know, a fun little fact, the atomic bombs nicknames were Fat Man and Little Boy. His plan worked, and on August 14th, Japan officially surrenders. World War II was officially over. The Axis powers had been defeated, and that is the end of battles in the Pacific.